Okay, so dealing with Unit 3, we're dealing with the institutions of American government, which include the Congress, the executive branch, the presidency, the judiciary, which are the federal courts, and then the bureaucracy, which is everyone who sort of works in government to carry out the statutes and laws that are passed by the other institutions. And so today we're going to focus, or this lecture, we're going to focus specifically on the Congress. And so we know that Congress is meant to represent the people. It's Congress's main job, and they're they're supposed to represent a constituency, and a constituency is going to be defined as the residents in an area where an official is elected. So if you live within a congressional district, you are a constituent of whatever individual is elected to represent you in Congress. And their primary responsibility should or is ultimately to their constituents, the people within their um, uh, own district, their district that they are elected from. And political scientist David Mayhew suggests that congressmen and women and senators are, quote, single-minded seekers of re-election, which means that everything that they do can be traced back to their goal of being re-elected. And so if this is true, it is very theoretical in nature, but if this is true, then they must be beholden to their constituents, or how else would they be reelected? So there is some debate as to whether or not that is their sole primary goal um, in their role as a lawmaker, as if they're going to be reelected. But it is a large theory that is debated in the political science community. And so that is something we'll probably look at as we move forward. And so, as they represent the nation, there are two different types of representation. We have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. And so, because we do have two chambers in our federal legislature, it is a bicameral legislature. And so we'll look at the House of Representatives first. The House of Representatives has 435 members. They are apportioned out to the different states according to population. So you take those 435, and each state gets a certain number based upon how large their population is. And every 10 years, we have a census that tells us which states are growing, which states are not growing, and we will reapportion the number of representatives to states. And so in the last census, Texas grew, the population of Texas grew, so we added like two more seats in the House of Representatives. And because we added two seats, some other state had to lose those. And so it's sort of a zero sum game. You either get more or you get fewer. Sometimes you stay the same. And so they are apportioned out by population. Members of the House of Representatives are elected to 2-year terms, and so they are constantly up for reelection because 2 years is really not very long. And so they get sworn in, they serve, and they have to immediately start thinking about their reelection campaigns. Members of the House of Representatives are more attuned to legislative needs and to local interest groups because they represent a smaller group of people typically. And the number of individuals that they represent is somewhere between 700 and 800,000 individuals per one representative. So you take the total population of the state of Texas and you divide it out by about 770,000 people, and that's going to tell you how many representatives that Texas should have. And so, as I said, it is based upon population, and so they only have to answer to um, a much smaller, especially in Texas, a much smaller group of individuals than somebody in the Senate might have to answer to, because the senator is going to represent an entire state. Right? So they people in the House of Representatives typically will have specific legislative agendas because they have the ability to focus on something very specific, one area of their state. So in Texas, if you are in my congressional district out here in West Texas, then you can focus on certain things, agriculture or oil or something of that nature, because those are going to be important things to your constituents because they are sort of the lifeblood of West Texas. But if you're a senator, you're going to have to think about a lot of different aspects of your state, and so as a member of the House, you're actually able to focus specifically on one or two smaller areas. And so typically in the House of Representatives, they're sort of that instant gratification chamber. They are interested in doing what their constituents need now because they're running for re-election in 2 years. And so they want to try to get things done on a much quicker turnaround than, say, the Senate. And so if we look over at the Senate only has 100 senators, and every state has two, no matter of size. And this goes back to that great compromise in the Constitutional Convention. So we have a chamber that represents us based on population, and one that is equal no matter the size of the state. And so that one would be the Senate. And the Senate is created to be the more deliberative body. They have more time to consider new ideas or bring together coalitions because they are elected for 6-year terms. And so they're more insulated from electoral pressure than members of the House who have to run every 2 years. The senators are going to have a more broad legislative agenda because they represent an entire state and must be attuned to the needs of all constituents in the state instead of just one small group. So the population of Texas is somewhere around 29 million people. And so the two senators in the state of Texas have to be attuned to not only the West Texans and the people in the Panhandle who do agriculture and oil. You got to be attuned to the things that go on along the coast and along the border and out in East Texas and in the Hill Country. And so there's a broad area that they have to represent. And so they're much more deliberative, and they have a much more broad legislative agenda because they have a whole bunch of people that they have to represent. And so if you look at the Constitution, there are some specific constitutional requirements that are necessary in order to run for one or the other chamber. And so if we look at the House of Representatives, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years prior to running. Your term length, again, is 2 years. And the number that represent each state, it depends on population. Texas has, I think, 38. California has 53. Some states have 1. So it's going to be anywhere between 1 and 53. Currently, we will do a new census in 2020, and reapportionment will occur. And their constituency is much more localized. But if we look at the Senate, it's that more deliberative body. And so the minimum age to run for the Senate is 30. You must have been a citizen for at least 9 years prior to running. Your term length is 6 years, and no matter the size of your state in land area or in population, everybody gets 2 senators. Every state gets 2 senators. So if you are a very small populated state and you have 1 member of the House, you have 2 senators, you are guaranteed at least 3 people to represent you in the federal legislature, and their constituency is that statewide constituency. Now, there are 2 different types of representation. One is called a sociological representation, and this is representatives that have the same race, gender, ethnicity, religion, or educational background as your constituents. And so if you feel like you are represented sociologically, you feel like the individual representing you is speaking on your behalf because y'all are the same. You have the same gender, you have the same race, you have the same ethnicity, etc. This type of representation promotes good representation, and the composition of a properly constituted assembly should mirror the composition of society. So that means that if we were to elect individuals to the federal legislature based upon our makeup in the total population, then we would see that sort of mirror uh, the legislature versus the entire population. So if 40% are white, then theoretically 40% of our legislature should be white. If 40% are African American, then 40% should be in the legislature should be African American. So sociological representation is a more personal type of representation because you feel like the person representing you is the same as you and sort of understands your plight and your needs and your the things that you fight. But by and large, we have what is known as agency representation. And agency representation takes place when constituents have the power to hire and fire their representatives. And so the individual who represents you might not be the same as you. It might not be the same race or gender or ethnicity or religion or educational background, but you feel like they're speaking on your behalf because you have the ability to decide their fate in the next election. You have the ability to hire and fire them. And this type of representation allows individuals with different backgrounds from their representative to feel like the representative is actually speaking on their behalf, right? Because you have the power to hire and fire that individual in the next election. So there are going to be some certain factors that affect election of representatives. And the first thing is going to be incumbency. And incumbency is defined as holding a political office for which one is running, meaning you're running for re-election. You've already been elected and you're running for re-election. If you are running for re-election, you are the incumbent. And once you are in office, you have access to a lot of tools that the person running against you, your opponent, does not have access to. And these are things like constituency services. As a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate, you have the ability to help people with their government-related problems. And so you have the ability to intervene on behalf of a constituent who is having problems with a government agency like the Social Security Department, the Veterans Affairs Department, passports, etc. And so when you step in on their behalf, when you step in on their behalf and you assist them in taking care of a problem with a government agency that they've been having, then you sort of, you ingratiate yourself to them, and people are much more likely to vote for you because you personally assisted them. And so you're seeking to establish personal relationships with your voters that your opponent cannot do. Because if you are a member of the House or the Senate and you call a government agency, they're more likely to start moving on an issue rather than, if you are running for election and you are not part of the government and you call the agency, they're not really going to take you very seriously. They're going to take the call from the representative much more seriously. And so incumbency does have this ability to formulate personal relationships with their voters. And so because of this, because of incumbency, you having certain tools at your disposal to assist in helping constituents, incumbents running for re-election have been re-elected at rates as high as 98% for the House of Representatives and as high as 90% for senators. And so it really does help if you're already in office. And incumbency also helps to scare off challengers, because challengers might fear that the incumbents have too much power or too much money to be defeated, and so they're just not going to waste their time in it. And so the incumbency advantage tends to promote what is known as the status quo in Washington. So it makes it harder for things to change. It makes it harder for women and minority groups to be elected and to participate in the process. And there are arguments for term limits that stem from incumbency advantage. This idea of getting new faces in Washington, because people sometimes are in office for way too long, and they have this incumbency advantage that scares off any fresh blood or fresh ideas that might come into the into the fray. Another factor that affects election of representatives is this idea of apportionment. And apportionment is the process of allocating congressional seats among the 50 states, which I said earlier happens every 10 years after the federal census. So state legislatures are going to be given census data, and they're going to be required to redistrict their states according to that new data. And so when reapportionment occurs and redistricting occurs, then states with a growing population are going to receive more seats in the House, and states with a shrinking or stagnant population will either lose seats or stay the same. And so when this occurs, congressional seats have to be redrawn, and if your state gets a representative taken away, then that's going to have to be absorbed, and there's going to be one less individual running for a congressional seat in that state. And so it does have the ability to sort of affect the election of individuals and who is going to represent you in Congress. And so in the last election, in the last process, Texas was the big winner with an additional 4 seats. We were able to get 4 seats. But because Texas got 4 seats, that means they had to come from some other states. And so because some other states' population wasn't growing as fast or they were shrinking, they had a seat taken away from them and reapportioned to the state of Texas. And so when they get the census data, the number, I said it was somewhere between 700 and 800,000. The number is about 787,000 people per one representative. And so when this occurs, then districts are going to be redrawn in a very, very highly political process. And what occurs during this time is gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the redrawing of districts to allow for to serve the interests of a particular group. So if the state legislature is drawing up new congressional districts in the state of Texas and they are controlled by one political party, they're probably going to want to draw lines that benefit that political party. And so gerrymandering does occur, and there's a couple of different types of gerrymandering. There is racial gerrymandering, which means drawing districts to allow for minorities to be better represented. And so this plays into that idea of sociological representation and tries to cut into that incumbency advantage that makes it harder for women and minority groups to actually be elected. Under racial gerrymandering, there have been some Supreme Court rulings that have occurred. Miller versus Johnson in 1995. The Supreme Court ruled that race cannot be the dominant factor for creating districts, but it didn't forbid race being a factor for creating districts. And so when you take that term dominant, what does that really mean? It's up for debate as to what that term means. And so it's very fluid, it's very nebulous in nature. And so if a district is drawn and race can be a factor, then as long as it can be proven that it is not the dominant factor, then race can play a role in how congressional districts are created. The second type of gerrymandering is obviously political gerrymandering, which is what we talked about earlier, which is drawing districts to allow one political party to be successful over another. And this happens in every state all the time. Whatever political party has the control is probably going to draw the lines to benefit their own political party. And these new congressional districts always end up in court. Somebody sues somebody else. It becomes a very highly political process, and sometimes it makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they have to either affirm or throw out the process or the maps that have been drawn, and so it becomes a very sticky and a very political process when reapportionment occurs. And we're going to be doing this in 2020, so 2020, 2021, so just get ready for that. One other factor that affects the election of a representative is this idea of patronage. And patronage is defined as providing direct benefits to constituents. And so if you are in office, you have the ability to provide direct benefits to constituents, somehow providing them with something that demonstrates that you're doing something. You're bringing home the bacon, essentially. And to play off of that metaphor there, we have what is known as pork barrel legislation, often known just as pork. And pork barrel legislation is going to be appropriations made for local projects, oftentimes not necessarily needed, but that help the local representative get reelected. And so this is seen as an extremely important thing to members' reelection bids because they're bringing home federal dollars to their congressional districts and they're creating actual tangible things that people can see. They're bringing home projects and bridges and roads and special benefits and research centers and this and that. And so there's money from the federal government pouring into certain congressional districts, and these are creating jobs. And so it demonstrates that, if you are a member of the Congress, you are doing something tangible to benefit your people. And so it ingratiates the people to you, and it helps to get you reelected. An example of some of these tangible things, these tangible projects and things. In the 2005 highway bill, there were 6,000 projects earmarked for special funding, special spending in the districts. And so in this bill, there were amendments that were added that earmarked or essentially set aside a certain amount of money for 6,000 different projects in different congressional districts across the United States. Now, there are only 435 congressional districts in the United States, but there were 6,000 projects earmarked for, placement in those 435 districts. And one of the most notorious or well known was what was known as the Bridge to Nowhere. And this became a big political thing, that eventually even caused sort of a hullabaloo when John McCain was running for president with his vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. And the Bridge to Nowhere was nearly a $400 million earmark for a bridge in Alaska to connect a town of Ketchikan, which has a population of 8,000 people, with Gravina Island. Okay, Gravina Island housed 50 residents in Ketchikan's airport. And so there was $400 million earmarked by the Alaskan legislation headed by Ted Stevens who was a senator from Alaska at the time, to create this Bridge to Nowhere. It would have replaced a 5-minute ferry ride that charged $6 for a round trip for individuals and $7 for automobiles. So you could spend $6 or $7 going across this little body of water from the mainland to the island, but this earmark was put into place to the tune of $400 million to connect a town of 8,000 to an island of 50 people and an airport. Ted Stevens, who was the senator from Alaska at the time, said on the Senate floor, this became kind of a political thing, and people were outraged, and it became sort of the face of government waste, and so people threatened to cut it, etc. And Ted Stevens on the Senate floor threatened to quit Congress if he did not get the funding that he requested. Well, ultimately, he did not get the funding. And he did not have to quit Congress because in 2008 he was defeated narrowly, very narrowly, in an election after being convicted of corruption. Now, it wasn't corruption based upon this funding for a Bridge to Nowhere. It was for some other charges, but he was defeated in 2008, and it was under charges of corruption, and this was in, as I said, 2008. He had served in the Alaskan legislature representing Alaska ever since Alaska had become a state. So he was a very long-standing, respected senator from the state of Alaska. And so around 2008, we start to have that big recession, and so this government spending kind of becomes a big issue, and we have that political campaign where Sarah Palin is the Alaska governor who becomes the nominee for vice president. She gets questioned on it. It becomes a really big stink. And so after this, the House begins to regulate earmarks more significantly by requiring all members of Congress supporting an earmark to identify themselves and to guarantee that they had no personal financial stake in the requested project. And they did something very similar in the Senate as well. And then in 2011, the House and the Senate agreed to a 2-year moratorium on earmarks in spending bills. And so they decided to do that, and there was some pressure to make that a permanent moratorium, but very few members actually supported a permanent moratorium. But interestingly enough, some political analysts actually claim that this moratorium on earmarks leads to more gridlock in the House and in the Senate, because there is no incentive for people to compromise. So back before this moratorium, you might support somebody else's legislation because then you could make a deal with them that they would then turn around and support your legislation. But because there is this moratorium on earmarks, that doesn't happen anymore. And so we're seeing more and more gridlock. But whatever the case, patronage, being able to bring home the bacon to your particular congressional district, will lead to some a very important factor that will affect re-election. One more piece of patronage that can help you to win re-election is private bills. And these are bills to provide specific relief for a specific individual. And it usually deals with immigration, which is providing a workaround for individuals seeking residency. I apologize for that. Seeking residency when the immigration quota for their particular nation has been maxed out. So private bills can also play a role in assisting with the election of representatives. And so we'll turn our attention to the organization of Congress. Congress is organized. There is leadership in each branch of the Congress, in each chamber of the Congress. And the leadership is decided by each political party, and each political party has their own group. We have the Democratic Caucus and the Republican Conference, and they get together and they elect their leaders from within their political party. And so in the House of Representatives, there are some seats, some leadership positions. There's the Speaker of the House, and the leader, the individual caucuses and conference, the Democratic Caucus and the Republican Conference, they come together and they nominate one person within their conference, their caucus, to be nominated as Speaker of the House, and then those names are then submitted to the entire House floor for a vote, and this will determine who the Speaker of the House is. And obviously, when this occurs, we already know who the speaker is going to be, because whatever party has the political majority is obviously going to elect their nominee for this role. And then you have the majority leader. This is the individual that is next in command. They are subordinate to the speaker. They assist with the legislative agenda, formulating the legislative agenda. And then you have the minority leader, who is the leader of the opposition. Whatever individual, whatever political party is in the minority, this person is going to be the leader of that minority group. Then you also have individuals that are called the whips, and the whips are individuals that coordinate the party's legislative strategy, and they build support for key issues. They wrangle votes, they whip up votes, they whip their individuals, their political caucus, all the people within the Democratic or the Republican Party. They essentially whip them in line to assure that they support the legislative programs that the majority or the minority is either putting into place or is trying to defeat. And then you have the Senate. And in the Senate, the leadership is a little bit different. They have a president, and the president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. Now, that job is extremely boring, because the only thing that the vice president can do as the president of the Senate is break a tie when there is a tie vote. He cannot vote otherwise. He cannot, bring forward legislation. And so it's a very boring job. And by and large, presidents are going to utilize their vice presidents in other ways. And so what occurs is a president pro tempore. And pro tempore is a Latin term that means for the time being. And so a president pro tempore is elected, and it is usually the individual with the longest serving record. So the person with seniority, the longest seniority in the majority party. And so they will step in as sort of the de facto leader of the Senate when the vice president is not on the floor. The role is largely ceremonial. There's really nothing that actually comes with that seat except maybe a little bit of respect and prestige. And so the real power is going to be held in the majority leader and the minority leader, who work together to set the legislative agenda and the calendar. Things in the House of Representatives are going to be much more structured because there's way more people in the House, 435. In the Senate, things are going to be a little bit more relaxed. And so there's not going to be as structured rules and things of that nature. Now, this lecture continues, and I'm going to continue this lecture, but I'm going to break it up into a couple of different parts, so it's not one continuous video that you have to watch. So we'll stop here. When we come back, oh, real quick, I'll show you this. These are the leadership in the House of Representatives. This is the current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. This is the current Majority Leader, and his name is Steny Hoyer. Nancy Pelosi is from California. Steny Hoyer is from Maryland, both Democrats because they currently have the majority in the House of Representatives. And this is the Minority Leader. He's from California as well, and his name is Kevin McCarthy. He is the Minority Leader of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. This is the leadership in the Senate, okay? This is Vice President Mike Pence, who is officially the president of the Senate, but he doesn't do just a whole lot, with that because he has other things to do, and it's kind of boring. And so Chuck Grassley, who is a senator from Iowa, is going to be the president pro tempore at this point in time. He is the longest serving Republican in the Senate, and so he has the seniority in that majority party. And then you have Mitch McConnell, who is the majority leader in the Senate, and he has a lot of power legislatively to control the legislative agenda. And then you have Chuck Schumer, and McConnell is from Kentucky, Grassley is from Iowa, Pence is from Indiana, and Schumer is from New York, and he is the minority leader. And so he leads the Democrats, who currently hold a minority in the Senate. And so when we come back in the next lecture, we're going to go through the committee systems in the Congress, which is where most of the work is going to be done. We'll talk about staff. We'll talk about how a bill becomes a law, which is kind of an arduous process. And then we will finish up with some other extra legislative duties that the Congress might have. So we're going to stop here. I'll do part 2 of this lecture in another video.